Thank you for joining us. My name is Mona Ateya. I am the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at GW. And we're delighted to have our guest, Ali Riza Güngen, who's going to be talking about his new book, The Politics of Debt, Financial Inclusion in Turkey, which was just published this year. And Ali is visiting assistant professor in the Department of Politics at York University. His research focuses on dependent financializations, state transformations, and public banks in the global South. His work has appeared in the Journal of Peasant Studies and New Political Economy, and he's published extensively on the political economy of emerging economies. In 2019, he edited the book, The Political Economy of Financial Transformation in Turkey, and he's also co-author of Financialization, Debt Crisis and Collapse, The Future of Global Capitalism, which is in Turkish. And he's going to be in conversation today with our very own Dr. Shana Marshall, who's Associate Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies, and he's an assistant professor, research professor at the Elliott School. And Dr. Marshall, before she joined GW, was a fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis and the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance at Princeton. And she is an active member in several research collectives, including Security and Context and the Forum on the Arms Trade. And she also sits on the editorial committee of the Middle East, and she's actually the chair of the editorial committee on the Middle East Research and Information Project, or MERIP, which publishes the Middle East Report. So her research focuses on the intersection of private finance and the global arms industry. And she received her doctorate from the University of Maryland, College Park. So the format for today's session is really a conversation between Shana and Ali about his work. And then there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions and to engage via the chat. So feel free to put your questions in there at any time. And at the end of the conversation, they will be addressed. Just before I hand the floor over to Shana, I want to thank Christian Clinton, our operations manager, who makes all of these events not just possible, but work seamlessly. And also Elad Raymond for all his work with the publicity and logistical side. And then finally, also want to acknowledge that Ali is also part of the Mesa Global Academy. So we're really delighted that we're able to continue our partnership with them. So thanks very much for attending, and Shana, I'll let you take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. And thanks, Ali, so much for being with us today. Very excited to get the chance to talk about political economy. So first, just to make sure that all the audience is sort of following along, can you give us a simple definition of financial inclusion? And what is the development community's most common approach to promoting financial inclusion? What tools or programs do they use to try to achieve that?
Let me start by thanking you and the Institute for Middle East Studies for inviting me. Thanks also to Mona and Christian as well. Financial inclusion means basically the removal of barriers against accessing financial services. It promotes reducing commissions, improving financial infrastructure, financial services, and increasing financial education. So by doing that, the narrative goes, the financial system will help citizens organize their future, relying on accessible financial services. And the mainstream narrative about the inclusion process was that the debt was beneficial for the borrower. It suggests the removal of barriers against access to finance as a way to overcome social exclusion in medium to long term. Institutions such as World Bank portray financial literacy as crucial for households to assume new investor positions and to assume some, or to change their way of behaving in the financial markets. World Bank played a massive role in shaping the policy agenda in the early 2000s. And OECD was also an important actor. The most common approach in the 2000s and early 2010s was a soft law approach, if I may use the term. We might use an analogy such as the COP26 meetings. Countries declare targets, but to what extent these targets are binding is another problem. So these targets, the suggestions coming from policy networks, they serve as a guideline in revising national or subnational legal frameworks. And international policy forums shape both the agenda and the reform attempts. But basically, the specific tools for promoting financial inclusion was designing campaigns, financial literacy campaigns, and of course, changing the legal framework to promote savings accounts, to reform pension systems, in a way convert those previous old pension systems. The emphasis was mainly on financial education and microcredit provision up until the mid-2010s. So financial education programs, financial literacy campaigns, co-sponsored by financial services corporations, states, commercial banks, and sometimes non-governmental organizations. They were the basic, they formed the basic tools of these financial inclusion programs. But in recent years, we have seen a shift towards more emphasis given to fintech, financial technology, digital technology provision, and changing the financial infrastructure now occupies the front seat of those financial inclusion initiatives.
Thanks. I'm glad you mentioned that. I definitely have some questions about the role of fintech companies in this process, which I'll get to in a minute. Your first sentence in that 2018 article you published on financial inclusion in Turkey in the journal New Political Economy says, quote, "The development community's new motto is financial inclusion." And you point to the securitization of development finance through the creation of tradable investment instruments that are comprised or capitalized by cash flows from development projects. Can you tell us why you think this came to be? Is it just a reflection of the financialization of the global economy overall? Is it an effort by capital to more effectively extract value from the vast informal economy in the global South? Or is it driven more by technocrats in the development community who are looking for a way to remain relevant in this new financialized global economy? Or all of the above?
Well, the answer is all of the above. So securitization is not something new. Yet this securitization of revenues or money flows out of public services and developmental projects has been the specificity of late 20th century and early 21st century. It reflects the increased penetration of finance into everyday lives and hence the financialization of the economies. Yet it has also a rationale for the development practitioners. Most of the global South economies suffer from low levels of savings. Mobilization of domestic savings was either done through domestic banks or massive state-centered projects in a developmentalist framework. That was the story of the mid-20th century. This changed in the late 20th century, and the mobilization of domestic savings is now done through more and more market-based mechanisms. And capital inflows and outflows condemn global South economies to boom and bust cycles. So policymakers basically believed policymakers in the Global South believe that a robust regulatory framework coupled with financial deepening initiatives would make it easier to attract new capital and also mobilize the domestic savings as well. The trust in financial mechanisms, the trust in originate to distribute models also paved the way for the securitization attempts. This was partly a result of the attempt to integrate previously excluded informal sectors of the Global South into global capital circuits as well. So the interesting aspect is here is the opening up of a new avenue through international policy discussions, through international policy networks. But what we observed was rather this initiative being embraced by the Global South policymakers in the early 21st century. It is very profitable for international financial capital to take part in this initiative, to engage in development finance, to engage in microcredit, for example. Yet the Global South policymakers embraced this initiative and presented it as a way to overcome poverty, way to overcome social exclusion. So in a sense, what we observe is like the mix of all of these pressures and demands crystallizing in financial inclusion agenda.
I find it really productive to compare other countries to the US. So in this case, Turkey and the US. So the accepted wisdom among political economists about the US is that the provision of very loose consumer credit to finance basic consumption, right? So education, purchasing cars, mortgages, et cetera. And then also just borrowing for everyday consumption purposes is absolutely necessary because real wages in the US have stagnated since the 1970s, meaning that most working class households no longer have sufficient income to maintain the standard of living that they had in previous generations. Comparing this to the many policies that you point to in Turkey and the efforts that the Turkish state took to slow down borrowing in the late aughts is very interesting. So these included a ban on installment loans for many items like mobile phones, which is very incredibly common in the US, requiring credit card companies to increase minimum payments to 22%, at least 22%, and then limiting the cash advances that credit card companies could offer to borrowers. Comparing these sorts of policies in Turkey to what we see in the US is sort of mind-boggling, because the idea that the US government would have the ability or the political will to force lenders to make such changes that would dramatically restrict their lending practices is really difficult to imagine, because it is precisely this kind of credit that is the foundation for the consumption of the vast majority of American households. So how would you compare the Turkish and the US state in light of this difference in terms of their different abilities to sort of control and regulate and oversee credit markets? Is the Turkish state just stronger vis-a-vis their financial sector, or where do you think the difference lies?
If we focus on putting limits to the installments, then we should probably say yes, Turkish state has a leverage vis-a-vis the domestic financial sector. Turkish state can put such limits and force banks to comply. This happened several times in the last decade. But I'm not sure if we should use the term strength vis-a-vis financial sectors. To achieve policy objectives, the Turkish policymakers have to use such limits, but it's never one-sided. It is never something imposed directly, or in these rare cases, it becomes a tool of negotiation between the financial sector and financial sector representatives and the state. For example, recently in September, Turkish state imposed a new limit on installments to drag down the growth of consumer credit. But this took weeks to declare this because of the negotiations. It was discussed with the bank managers. Only after their input, the limit was declared. So Turkish state, like many other global South countries, has leverage vis-a-vis the domestic financial sector, but interventions are never one-sided, or they do not remain one-sided. It becomes a part of the tension between capital groups, in the Turkish case, internationalized, very strong capital groups, and the policymakers. And also the limits or such restrictions are not permanent. They stay there for a couple of months, maybe a year or so, but then they are lifted. It depends on the way policymakers conceive the trajectory of the Turkish economy. So during the pandemic, for example, Turkish state pushed the banks to lend more. And they changed the asset calculation ratio to do that. They also use the public banks to do that. This was something, again, severely criticized by the private banks at that time during the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic. But it was not a permanent feature. And more importantly, Turkish state does not have such kind of leverage against international finance. As we have seen in recent years in several episodes, the tensions end with Turkish state accepting the subordinate position vis-a-vis international financial investors.
Which is, of course, very common, not just really for the global South, but I would also argue for many of the, sort of core capitalist countries also. Your work in particular aims to identify the specificities of financialization and what we might call predatory financial inclusion in Turkey, including with respect to gender, as well as the current distribution of financial power in the Turkish financial sector, which centers around the state's oligopolistic commercial banks. Can you give us the outlines of these specificities and what is most distinct and unique to the Turkish case that we may not see reproduced in other countries of the global South?
So the distinctiveness is mainly about the microcredit sector and the state's proactive role in drafting the financial inclusion strategy. I prefer to implement a three-pillar strategy in analyzing the financial inclusion process and transformations associated with financial inclusion. The first one is strategy formation. The second one is the design of financial literacy and education campaigns. And the third one is the microcredit sector, how it's organized, how it's managed. In terms of the strategy formation, Turkish state was very active in the early 2010s, becoming a part of these international policy networks. But this is not very distinctive. Many states became a part of those international policy networks, Alliance for Financial Inclusion, and so on and so forth, and they benefited from these guidelines coming from these international policy networks in designing the financial inclusion policies. I believe one of the distinctive aspects resides on the way financial infrastructure and financial services were conceived by the Turkish policymakers. They have seen almost no problem with the fees and commissions, with the financial infrastructure, and they, in a way, did not problematize the supply side of the equation. So it was more about designing financial literacy campaigns, financial education programs in the Turkish strategy. So this is a bit more, this is slightly different from the other global South countries whose financial inclusion strategies included various steps taken to improve financial infrastructure, to redesign banking sector. This was not the case in Turkey. the literacy campaigns, the education campaigns targeted women. And this is not something also distinctive, because in most of the cases, more often than not, it was mainly the disadvantaged groups, previously excluded sectors, previously excluded segments being targeted. Women were the primary group in that sense. The other distinctive part is the state-sponsored, state-organized microcredit sector. So in most of the cases, India is the prominent example here. Commercial microfinance institutions prevailed in the sector. They were predominant in organizing the microfinance regulations, organizing the sector, and keeping up the tempo of extending credit. This was not the case in Turkey. The main agent in the microfinance sector is an association, a vakıf, that is in collaboration with the Grameen Bank. And the way they organize the microcredit services is pretty much shaped by states' concerns, and it's hard to differentiate whether it is the Turkish state extending the microcredit or the vakıf or the association that is in collaboration with the Grameen Bank extending credit. Sometimes it's hard to, the boundaries are very blurred. So this is one of the specificities of the Turkish case. And it still goes on, the influence and the strength of this, association in the microcredit sector. So I believe the proactive role of the state, not problematizing the financial infrastructure at all, and also the almost 2 decades of microcredit provision, mainly controlled by the state actors. These are the specificities of the Turkish case.
The literacy, the financial literacy campaigns, did you look at the actual sort of content of those, right? I guess the presentation slides that were being used, right, in these educational, I guess, seminars that they were giving to often to poor women. I wonder what, it always boggles my mind, because so often the people in these financial literacy seminars, whether they're in the US or in, they have a lot of these in the Gulf countries targeting migrant workers who work for extremely low wages, right, primarily in construction and domestic service. It's always difficult for me to think of what people must be saying in these presentations to these groups, because they are, by and large, barely surviving, right? So are they telling them that they can become entrepreneurs by, by taking out these small loans? I mean, what is the sort of, when reality sort of meets up with the, I guess, the discourse that these development finance professionals are coming in with, what does it look like when those two things sort of, I guess, collide?
So the discourse is pretty much based on a self-responsibilizing discourse. You're responsible for your future and you should plan your future. The content of these educations is pretty straightforward. The interest rate calculation, and it takes hours, and then followed by long seminars detailing how to organize the expenditures of the household. So most of the cases, the financial education programs targeting women, they conceived women as the representatives of the household, and like as if it was the women's job to organize the household budget. So the part of the education is really about the household expenditures and how to in a way save more by making some rational choices. In more advanced courses, in more advanced financial literacy campaigns, it is the content is complemented by some suggestions about the pension choices and long-term financial decisions, how it impacts the situation of the household in longer term. But yeah, the discourse is really interesting given the fact that the formal sector in Turkey suffered from wage stagnation for the last 2 decades. And we know that the informal sector, which comprises 1/3 of the labor market, and the ratio is higher in female employment, those workers receive less than the workers in the formal sector. So they are in a worse situation, and they are now advised, they receive the advice from these campaigns to save more, to do more for their own good, to be more responsible and more rational. So this is an interesting combination. The education campaigns are like interesting combination, and it shows that at the same time I'm trying to pick my words in a good way, but I cannot do that. Some of those campaigns were scam, and the content of the education was really disgraceful.
Yeah, that's sort of related to another of my questions, which is, I guess, just sort of to extend this discussion, is that these campaigns serve this dual purpose, right? So on the one hand, they're a cover, like a corporate social responsibility sort of campaign for the underlying profit motive that seeks to generate returns, even from the poorest borrowers. But they also serve this additional purpose, this sort of process of indoctrination, right? Since the poor are often the most radicalized subjects because of the intensity and the constancy with which they are exploited, turning them into good neoliberal subjects requires that they be made a participant in their own exploitation and then also made to take responsibility for it. So by turning someone into a borrower and a consumer of formal financial products, they are set on this path toward becoming an entrepreneur and someone who, and this is the sort of language you hear in the US, someone who invests in themselves. The fact that this results only in their further indebtedness and hyper exploitation can then be presented to them as a function of their own failings, their own individual mistakes. So this process seems designed to undermine demands for an end to exploitation through things like demands for better wages or demand for access to public services, which, as you point out, are the underlying determinants for the vast majority of borrowing, of course, because people don't have enough money to meet their day-to-day subsistence requirements, and they no longer really have access to decent public services because those are continually scaled back. Is this process uncontested in Turkey, this sort of creation of the neoliberal subject? Is the use of market terminology as common in Turkey as it is in the US, right? So consumers or borrowers rather than citizens, or employees rather than workers, et cetera. How are people resisting these classifications? And then how are the financial interests sort of responding to that resistance and trying to dampen it?
The process is certainly definitely contested, and it reflects itself in the electoral manifestos of the opposition parties. So from 2015 onwards, this became more visible. The opposition parties promise generous debt restructuring schemes in their electoral manifestos to address those demands. Yet, the market terminology is something common, accepted, used, widely accepted, and its origins go back to even the 1980 military coup, destroying left-wing organizations and trade unions, weakening labor organizations. So, despite there is this discontent, and the process is contested, but I don't think people are doing this resistance or showing their discontent in a systematic manner. There are some individual protests, once in a while protests, but there's no systematic and organized resistance to the stagnation of wages, increased debt levels, on rising inflation, and all sorts of problems that come with this transformation. Some sociologists prefer to refer to solidaristic ties in the Turkish society as a way of overcoming these difficulties. I believe that is a myth. If the society had such solidaristic ties, then they were gone in the neoliberal period in the last 3 or 4 decades. What we see is that Turkish society is now more integrated into the financial system, more and more people using these financial services, and they are more indebted. And the debt of women increased more rapidly than that of men. And as a result of the pension regulations, as a result of the intervention into the pension system from 2012 onwards, more and more people have savings accounts as well. And this is like the main element used to legitimate the financial inclusion processes, referring to the increased savings and the number of people that have access to emergency funds in the banking sector. But I don't believe that this is enough to legitimate this process, given the indebtedness ratio, given the high interest rates and the turbulence in the Turkish economy. But since there is no systematic resistance, financial interests or financial capital, I believe, is very happy with the situation. There are some specific tensions because of the crisis of Turkish political economy, the crisis of the growth model in Turkish political economy. The model of the 2000s do not work in the 2010s, certainly not in the last 3 or 4 years. But in terms of integrating people, including people into the financial system, since there is no systematic resistance, it's still presented as a smooth process by many financial sector representatives and state actors.
Thank you. So this is taking us sort of looking back a little bit, or maybe sideways, I guess, but much of the rationale for financial inclusion, the sort of discourse that comes from the development community, is to free poor people from the inefficient and possibly illicit financial services of loan sharks and informal lenders. This immediately brought to my mind, because I just read Aaron Jake's excellent book, Egypt's Occupation, the discourse of British officials who occupied Egypt in the late 19th century in order to secure repayment on loans that that British banks had made to the Egyptian monarchy. These officials believed that the key to recovering these funds lay in unleashing the industrious spirit of the Egyptian peasant by removing this class of rural lenders that had previously been exploiting peasant borrowers, and replacing that with a system of formal bank loans that would, of course, be administered by British occupation officials. This only served to generate a huge wave of European speculative investment in Egypt that then inflated land and other factor prices so much that millions of peasants lost what little property they did have. And then for their efforts, the British sparked a financial contagion that ruined many British banks and spread throughout Europe. Do you see other corollaries, either in history or across geographic space, that allow us to contextualize this process of contemporary financial inclusion as one that is endemic to capitalism and just manifests in sort of slightly different form over and over again? Or what's new about this most recent phase of democratizing finance?
The emphasis on industry spirit the workers' spirit cannot be overemphasized. This was an organic part of this has been an organic part of the inclusion discourse and process. But this is also something we can see in the history of global South economies, certainly in Turkish history. For example, in the early Republican era, the establishment of state-owned banks and transformation of some savings funds into development banks were described as removing a yoke of money lenders, the pressure of money lenders from the neck of hardworking Turkish peasants. So this was the way it was legitimated in the early Republican era. With regards to the similarities of this or differences of current financial inclusion processes with some previous financial expansion episodes, I think that we can approach this issue from a perspective highlighting global financial expansion episodes. There were protests, for example, in London in the late 19th century regarding the terms of Ottoman debt repayments. When global financial expansion episode, when we observe a global financial expansion episode, people are more and more integrated into the global flows, global capital flows, and the capital circuit. So the 21st century or late 20th century transactions sometimes resemble those negotiations, transactions that were seen in the late 19th century. The specificity of the current age or the financial inclusion age is the household indebtedness. Never in the world history have we ever seen such high levels of household indebtedness, and never in the world history have we ever witnessed this many people becoming a part of the global financial system. So this is the specificity of the current age, integrating billions and billions of people into the financial system and making them part of the global financial system.
Facilitated, of course, by these, increasingly by these fintech companies that I hope we'll maybe get to mention later. I did want to move, we do have at least one question from an audience member. This is from Naz Yusel, who's a PhD student here at GW. She says, thank you for the presentation. Her question is about sort of building on what we were talking about previously with, including sort of bringing poor women into this process. Her question is about the inclusion of refugees in some of these sort of financial literacy or microfinance programs and what that looks like currently in Turkey.
Turkish state is still struggling with the integration of refugees, and they are trying to update their system in a way, knowing which person, which household lives in a particular region, and when they move to another city or province. So they are trying to, in a way, organize this system. So they did not develop a system in terms of financially integrating refugees and migrants. So this leads to some problems. The Syrian refugees in particular, but also other refugees, use informal intermediaries in their financial transactions. Jewelry shops in Istanbul are renowned for providing those services by using some gold transactions. And in terms of data, we do not have any data regarding the integration of refugees and migrants, and we do not know their financial behavior. I think that in the upcoming years, this will be a huge topic in the Turkish political economy scene, and we will also observe some initiatives coming from the policymakers, since now the refugees and migrants are more than 6% of the total population in Turkey. But yeah, in terms of state initiatives, policy making, and data, we know almost nothing still, despite this decade of transformation.
So these, to follow up on that, these informal sort of money lenders who you mentioned, jewelry shop owners who obviously probably have access to a great deal of cash, right, which enables them to become sort of informal money lenders. Are they, I mean, I guess they might be opposed to these financial inclusion measures if it makes it easier for people to get access to formal bank loans in another way. But of course, I guess the spatial fix here has been the advent of a massive refugee population that can replace the population of Turkish borrowers that may be moving into the formal borrowing economy. So is that, do you see, I guess, these informal money lenders catering more to the refugee class as Turkish, even very poor Turkish citizens move into these formal borrowing structures?
Yes, they already did that. The informal financial service provision is widespread among the refugee population and migrants. So the new target of the commercial banks in the 2020s will be that group. It's because of the high interest rates and the ongoing currency crises in Turkey. Now we do not see new initiatives coming from the commercial banks. And of course, the policymakers are preoccupied with navigating the crisis. But once the dust is settled, what we will observe is the renewed initiatives to include more and more women. There's still some room there. Followed by new initiatives that target migrant population and in a way trying to kick the informal sector out of financial service provision. So this will be the topic of the 2020s.
Great. Naz actually has a follow-up to that previous question. She says, do you think this is an intentional policy of financial exclusion to force unregistered refugees, kayıtlısı, I have no Turkish language.
Unregistered,
so,
yeah.
Okay, to force them to be registered for the state to control their movement, or is it not even a consideration altogether by the state?
Thank you, Naz, for the questions. Turkey state wants to register those refugees and wants to trace those refugees in their every movement. But the state does not have such capacity to trace the movement of those refugees, millions and millions of people. But I don't think, at least we do not have any data, any news, any reports suggesting that the preference by the Turkish state has something to do with the financial exclusion of migrants. On the contrary, I have been part of some conferences, I mean, following the discussions about this topic. It's something discussed by the Turkish policymakers. It's something discussed by the international aid organizations. How can we pave the ground for social and followed by financial inclusion of the newcomers, the massive migrant population? So it's something ongoing, but the Turkish state does not have that capacity to come up with very efficient plans that can sort out these problems. So the problems go on, and if there emerges a kind of a power shift in the Turkish political scene, of course, this will become more controversial because of the fact that the newcomers have such an agenda to financially exclude the migrants in order to, forgive my use of the term, send them back to Syria or their birthplace. So it is something contested, but as long as the current power bloc prevails, they have this agenda to financially include those migrants. They cannot do that, but they do not have the capacity.
Thank you. If anybody else has questions, please put them in the chat now, because this is your time to ask questions. So if you don't ask them, I'll just continue speaking, and then we'll probably close maybe around 1 or just right after. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat now. This is a question, I guess, zooming out quite a bit. It's a very sort of structural question, but do you think financial inclusion as practiced by the global development community is an expression of financial capital that is going abroad in search of new markets? Is it mainly because consumers and borrowers in the global north have sort of maxed out their ability to borrow? And that the search for a new, even if it's poorer and more precarious, class of borrowers in the global south is what is driving this sort of financial inclusion agenda?
Sure, this has been a factor in the financial inclusion agenda. Consumers in the global north appear to have reached their limits of borrowing, but I should mention that it depends on the repayment capacity and the interest rates. There is no given benchmark in terms of indebtedness. It's much like the sovereign debt discussions in the early 2010s. I'm sure that people will remember there was this discussion about the benchmark of sovereign debt to GDP ratio. People genuinely believed that if sovereign debt to GDP ratio remained above 60% or 90%, it would force austerity and drag down the growth rates eventually in a short amount of time. Yet interest rates remained low, so it was not a problem for sovereign, the state managers. So the sovereign debt continued to increase. As long as the interest rates remain low, as long as the debt is collateralized, it can continue growing. It's different in the global south. The share of collateralized debt is not necessarily high. The collateralized debt is not necessarily the most significant part of household debt. And more importantly, interest rates are consistently high in the global south countries. So this puts a limit to household borrowing in the global south. This limits further household borrowing. It's incredibly harder to roll over debt for the households. That is definitely the case in Turkey. The household debt to GDP ratio stagnated in the last 7 years, mainly because of the high interest rates. And so financial capital searched for new markets and succeeded in finding many. But there might not be much room for newcomers to the credit market. The financial capital has to find new markets, continue finding new markets, and has to find some alternative means to profit from. And this leads us to this speaks to the importance of financial technology and digital technology. Removing access to finance, removing barriers against access to finance is not enough. The financial capital has to find ways to extract more revenue from the account holders, to nudge their behavior in certain directions, so that more and more money comes from their transactions. Yes, so what I'm saying is that they were successful in the 2010s. International financial capital was successful in finding new markets, but they have to do more. And this is why we will be speaking about the increased use of financial technology in the next decade.
I definitely want to get to this question because it's so interesting to me. These financial technology companies or fintech companies, Turkey being a relatively sort of directly regulated environment for these to operate in, but in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Indian subcontinent, you have all of these sort of startup fintech firms, which are totally unregulated because they're incorporating or they're subsidiaries of telecom companies, right? Because they're technology apps. So they're not regulated as actors within a banking sector, even though they are lending. They're lending through these totally uncollateralized, unsecured, right, apps basically on mobile phones. And because everyone has a mobile phone, people are borrowing literally just to meet their day-to-day needs. And they're borrowing small amounts, but of course they're unable to pay those back. But because these fintech companies are proliferating so quickly, it's basically become a sort of Ponzi scheme where individuals borrow from a different fintech app to pay off the debt that they borrowed from the previous fintech app. But because those initial market entrants are getting paid, and because they're charging such high interest rates, they're just, I guess, piling into this market in order to make as much money as quickly as possible before the entire sort of thing collapses. So can you tell us to what extent anything like this is present in the Turkish sector, or what the sort of evolution of fintech and financial inclusion looks like in the Turkish case, or what you expect it to look like maybe going forward?
So perfect question. The story that you mentioned about the fintech companies trying to lend more and more before everything collapses, it's much like the commercial microcredit crisis in the 2000s, such as Bosnia. The situation was similar. Bosnian people borrowing from several microfinance institutions just to smooth out their consumption, and it led to a kind of crisis. The fintech companies, there is this relatively advanced financial infrastructure when compared to other global south countries in Turkey, and the fintech companies are they do not have a distinct presence, distinct from the commercial banking sector, commercial financial institutions. So they're very much related to their operations and their systems. And so we do not see a kind of a financial technology or international financial technology companies pouring in, investing into Turkey to design some new apps and design some new lending schemes. So this has not been the case in Turkey. I believe the shift in the last 3 or 4 years has been a crucial factor in the almost absence, in terms of the absence of fintech companies. The Turkish emphasis on financial inclusion, the state's emphasis on financial inclusion, departed or parted ways with the international policy discussion from 2017, 2018 onwards. So now the credit campaigns are not legitimated or are not promoted by referring to responsible borrowers, planning for future, but rather they are promoted as a way of investing in Turkey, investing in Erdogan administration, investing in the authoritarian statecraft. So this discourse is very different from the one ongoing in the international policy circles. And this provides a kind of barrier against the emergence of new initiatives that promote financial technology use or support financial technology use. Having said that, I should also add that of course, financial technology companies are doing their best to monitor consumer behavior, and they are accumulating data. but we do not see similar initiatives similar to the ones such as in Kenya, for example. When it comes to lending, it's mainly lending from a commercial bank, going to the branch, signing those documents and borrowing money from them, not borrowing through mobile means. But I hope that I made myself clear in terms of the emphasis on the shift, making things more controversial. It's not about planning your future, but it's more about now becoming a part of Erdogan administration against the international conspiracy ongoing. So this discourse is really weird, and it may have some effect. It may impact the discussion, the policy discussion in the short to medium term in Turkey.
Thank you so much. I don't see other questions, and that exhausts all of my very long-winded questions for you today. But so thank you, Ali, so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it. It was a pleasure.
It's always great to talk to somebody about political economy, because it's not such a widespread sort of, I mean, Turkey, I know, has actually a lot more active sort of political economists looking at Middle East politics, but in the US, it's a little bit less. So it was really great to have you here and talk to you today. And thanks everyone so very much for joining us. We do have, of course, an upcoming event in our series. You can just visit our website, Google IMES, GWU, and you'll see our entire event series there for the rest of the academic year. Thanks so much again, Ali. Thanks, Mona, and thanks, Christian, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, Shana. Yeah, the next event is with Karim Rabia on December 2nd. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, Ali, for a really great discussion.